Welcome to the Research Reimagined podcast, brought to you by Nottingham Trent University. I'm your host, Helen Darby-Dowman, and I'll be inviting some of NTU's brightest minds to explore how their research is helping us to deepen our understanding of the world. From online addictions to transgender rights and sleep disorders. Listen as we discuss some of society's most pressing challenges and uncover some of the ways our research is making a difference. There's recently been a global debate on who is eligible to compete in women's sports, specifically whether trans women should be allowed to compete in female categories. Trans women have already been barred from competing in female categories for elite-level swimming and rugby league fixtures, with other sports looking to follow suit. Swimming's governing body, FINA, last year voted to restrict the participation of trans women who have gone through male puberty, which is currently the most restricted rule to be issued by an Olympic sports body. FINA have stated that those who are ineligible to compete may participate in open categories that they plan to develop in the future alongside men. Trans rights campaigners argue that excluding trans athletes is harmful and discriminatory, whilst critics say that trans women have an unfair physical advantage in female competition. The current media narrative appears to be missing one side of the debate. Are these decisions, which are excluding trans and gender diverse athletes, legal? And how are these decisions impacting trans and gender diverse athletes psychologically? To help us answer these questions, we're joined by two senior researchers whose research focuses on trans and gender diverse issues. Welcome, Beth. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Dr. Beth Jones. I'm a senior lecturer within the Department of Psychology. I identify as a cis female and my preferred pronouns are she, her. And my research looks at the health and well-being of marginalised populations, and I've kind of especially focused on the health and well-being of trans and gender diverse people.
And Seema, welcome too. Will you just also give us a little introduction?
Sure. My name is Dr. Seema Patel. I'm a senior lecturer in law at Nottingham Law School. I identify as cis female and my preferred pronouns are she, her. My research looks at discrimination in sport and the regulatory balance between inclusion and exclusion in competitive sport.
So thank you both for joining us today. Before we get started, it might be useful for our listeners if you could define the different terms we'll be discussing this episode. So Beth, can you explain what we mean when we talk about trans and gender diverse people?
Yeah, so transgender diverse people are those that experience an incongruence between the gender that they're assigned at birth and their gender identity. And they're both umbrella terms, so trans and gender diverse, that are used to capture a wide range of different gender identities. And they can be really useful for things like today's discussion, but it's important to, I suppose, emphasise that not everyone will use these terms, identify with them. Usually we use trans to describe individuals who identify within the binary, so male or female, and we'll use gender diverse to describe individuals who have a gender identity outside this binary gender system. But again, it's important to emphasise that this terminology in this area is constantly evolving, and although transgender diverse is perhaps the most widely used and accepted today, that might not necessarily be the case tomorrow. In terms of cis, so we'll be using cisgender throughout today's podcast, and this is used to describe individuals that don't experience that incongruence between their gender assigned at birth and gender identity. And again, we acknowledge that not everyone identifies with this term, but for conversations like this, it's really useful to have that term to capture those individuals that don't experience the incongruence.
The global discourse about trans inclusion in sports has tended to be focused on the biological side of the debate, with many critics saying that trans women have an unfair physical advantage over cis women in female competition. Do you have any comments on the current research on the trans athletes and the current global debate?
Well, from a biological perspective, I think that it's generally assumed based on a number of studies that the trans female athletes retain physiological advantage, and that is currently at odds with the binary categorisation of male and female within sport. So on that basis, it's argued that trans female athletes shouldn't compete in the female category because they will have an unfair advantage over cis female athletes.
And how does your research differ to this debate?
I'm a health psychologist, so I'm very much interested in health and well-being, especially of marginalised populations like trans and gender diverse people. And I kind of come to this debate with the the consideration of the kind of psychological implications that preventing transgender diverse people competing in sport might have. So it kind of has increased massively the negative narrative around these people's lives, which we know causes a great degree of distress, and we know that that does have implications for people's psychological well-being, but also their physical health as well. And that's quite problematic because there's also a wealth of research that has found that actually being physically active has a lot of psychological benefits, not only mental health, but this idea of kind of being socially connected as well. So that's kind of the angle that I approach this from.
And my perspective is a legal perspective, so I'm focused on law and regulation and ensuring that any rules that are in place to determine eligibility are founded upon principles of law and human rights, to ensure that trans athletes also are able to assert their rights regardless of whether they're in society or in sport. So my angle focuses on the law and human rights.
And so can you explain to me a bit about why this topic is so important to you both?
I got into psychology as an undergraduate because I've always been interested in, I suppose, making the world more inclusive, making society more inclusive. And I'm really passionate about stigma and the negative implications of stigma. Hence, I've kind of got into this area of research looking at a really vulnerable and marginalised population within society.
And for me, my research began in discrimination, so sports law is my area. And when I started looking at the participation of trans athletes in sport 20 years ago, it was very hypothetical. We had maybe one or two instances, and we've seen a massive development and evolution of that over the last 20 years, and now it's the centre of media, global media attention. But I am very passionate about ensuring that athletes are treated fairly and that their rights are not diminished because they are participating in sport.
And so you kind of touched on it just there, Seema, but what are some of the challenges that you face with your research and I guess in that kind of looking at how do you support the trans and gender diverse people?
It's a really key question at the moment. The debate has become really polarised, and I think it's fair to say quite toxic at times. Public opinion is quite heated on the matter of whether a trans female athlete should be able to compete in the female category or not, and everybody, rightly so, has an opinion on it. But I think what becomes very blurred is the line between opinion and fact, and I think researchers like myself and Beth are really focused on ensuring that fact and evidence drive this rather than assumptions.
Absolutely, no, I agree with that, and I think it's problematic, the kind of narrative that's being held in society at the minute, because trans voices get lost in all of this, and I personally find that really problematic. That it seems to be dominated by cis people, and we're forgetting actually that this is about real people's lives.
So Beth, can you explain a bit about the psychology side of things and perhaps what when you're talking about everybody's got an opinion and it's, it is a big debate, what is it that is maybe the lack of understanding from many people's point of view?
Yeah, so I think obviously there's the argument around testosterone, which is prominent. And I think, as we've already kind of touched on, the evidence there is weak. So as scientists, we want policies to be underpinned by robust, direct evidence. And unfortunately, that is lacking in this area. So there's a lack of direct research with trans people, looking at how these hormones interact with their athletic ability. But what we do have a wealth of is evidence that have supported, the stigma, the discrimination that these people experience, the impact that has on these people's lives. So we know that it has implications for mental well-being, is associated with increased suicidal tendencies within this population. And although these kind of policies and arguments at times are meant to be focused on elite athletes, they do have real impacts on even recreational sport and people wanting to take part in sport at grassroots levels. And that was evidenced through research that I did back in 2018, where young trans people spoke about these policies and how even though they just wanted to take part in their local football team, they felt fearful of doing so because they were aware of these policies and the negative kind of narrative that surrounded them.
And so what sort of interventions do we need to put in place, or what kind of interventions are you working on?
For me, I am very interested in addressing negative societal attitudes, and I think that research at the minute is so timely, given that negative narratives, unfortunately, have really grown, over even the past week within the media. So I'm really interested in addressing those negative attitudes, understanding why people might hold those, and then how we can address them with different types of interventions. So I kind of look at it from that perspective, so addressing it societally, but also for me it's about supporting trans people, making society more inclusive, and that is in part looking at physical activity and how we can make those spaces more inclusive, but also kind of broader community activities around alleviating loneliness, enhancing social connection, and I think that is also with the aim of, I suppose, promoting contact between cis and trans people to perhaps address some of those negative attitudes as well.
And is there sort of any interventions that have been put in place where you've seen things working very well, or have you got any examples that you can share with us?
There are a lot of kind of community level interventions, so a lot of community groups available that when trans or other marginalised groups take part in, they can be really beneficial for this population's mental health. In terms of sport and exercise, moving towards making these spaces more inclusive. So yeah.
And Seema, from a law perspective, what are the legal implications of some of these decisions?
Just to touch on some of the things Beth has said there, it's really valuable that we do hear about the lived experiences of these athletes. And there's been a lot been said this week about fear. That cis female athletes are fearful of speaking out, trans female athletes are fearful of speaking out. And I respect that, and I think there needs to be a much more open platform for both groups to be able to speak about these things. But from a research perspective, absolutely, we have an absence of hearing from the lived experiences of trans female athletes because the group is so small, essentially. And also, when we're looking at this debate, we can't just look at this from a science point of view. We have to look at this from a psychological, social and legal perspective. And I think that's what makes this so important when you hear Beth's research. You can't ignore that when you're trying to determine eligibility. That's really, really important research we need to listen to. The legal landscape is really interesting at the moment because that is also developing. If we go outside of sport, there is a robust human rights framework that exists at an international, regional and domestic level. And within those levels, provisions such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights seeks to protect us from discrimination and promote equality on the grounds of sex and other status. And what's happening is gender identity has been accepted as encompassed within the wide definitions of sex or other status, but those reforms are still taking place. If we look at a domestic level in the UK, we have the Equality Act and the Gender Recognition Act, which recognises the rights of trans people. However, there is an exemption clause within those provisions that says that allows sport to exclude trans people or people if it is a gender-affected activity. My issue with that, based on my research, is that the exemption provision has existed in our legislation for a very long time, and it's evolved to now exist in the Equality Act and the Gender Recognition Act. But I feel that it needs review, particularly review in a modern society to ensure that it's fit for purpose. And what mustn't be forgotten is that it can only apply if it's a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. And sport are holding on to that exemption to say, okay, we can then ban trans people from competing. But I think that legislation, again, does need reform and review. So sports bodies are reacting to this by introducing policies that either ban trans people, some may allow, some may place conditions on that participation. And we have kind of a piecemeal approach to this at the moment. And I think that's part of the problem. There is a lack of harmonisation. conversation. But it's true that not one size fits all when it comes to developing this policy, and it is very sport specific. I believe it's very case specific as well, which adds to the complexity.
I mean, they talk about different categories, aren't they? Talk about creating maybe an open category, certainly in some sports. I mean, Beth, talk to me a little bit about how that has an implication perhaps for trans and gender diverse people.
Yeah, so I think obviously they're introducing this to mitigate some of the issues and the concerns. But I think for a lot of trans people, gender diverse people, this idea of an open category would be quite distressing. Firstly, because you're outing yourself as trans or gender diverse by partaking in an open category. But also, within that, it can be really distressing, I suppose, to be competing alongside perhaps, people who are of a different gender identity to you. So when I've spoken to people in the past about competing in accordance with the gender that they are assigned at birth, rather than their gender identity, they spoke about how that would be a really distressing experience because it doesn't align with their gender identity. So I think that this open category needs a lot of thought, and we need to speak to trans and gender diverse people directly about how being part of an open category would make them feel.
Because obviously it's kind of creating an environment where they can compete, but ultimately, on a psychological side of it, actually it's not at all. So you're looking at one side you're winning, and on the other side it's not. And certainly for those athletes, it's actually not an option. Is that what we're...
Yeah, I think it would probably, on the most part, deter people from wanting to compete. So it seems that, its desired outcome is not going to be reality. It's not going to encourage trans and gender diverse people to compete, but actually through psychological distress deter them from doing so.
And do you think part of this is just that you made the comment that all female athletes, cis athletes, transgender athletes, they're actually feeling they can't make a comment? Is that kind of part of the problem why we get this very polarised point of view, because there's only a few people actually voicing a very strong opinion?
I think so. I think that it is becoming, it wasn't like that perhaps a few years back, but increasingly it is becoming like that. People don't feel they can speak up because there are perhaps minorities who are speaking louder than the rest, and that then polarises the discussion.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I completely agree.
And what do you think the shift is? If you're saying, go back a number of years, it wasn't quite like this. Why have we suddenly seen this sort of shift?
For me, it started with the cases relating to athletes with sex variations who were Duty Chand and Caster Semenya, and their cases really threw this into the spotlight. And as a result of sports bodies having to review those rules, the trans athletes' rules were also thrown to the centre of public attention, and I think that's where the switch happened.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when you look back at the attention around those athletes, that's when things really kind of hit off with trans athletes, and they really became under the spotlight, especially trans female athletes.
Going back, I know we're not here to talk about that wider debate of certainly what's in the press at the moment, but is it that at the minute we're very much looking, or what we see in journalistic side in the press is very much about the biological side? How do we go about trying to, or tell me more about your research and how that will shape getting that more even viewpoint?
Yeah, I think, sometimes within the debates that I had, as I said before, people forget that these are real people. This is real people's lives that we're debating, in effect, and looking at the psychological implications of these policies is really, really important. And I do think that it gives a fuller picture. It makes the debate more real. People can appreciate that this is about real people, and actually making these changes can have devastating effects on people's lives. And I think that gets forgotten in a lot of this.
And for me, yes, I completely accept that biology and those issues are key when you're looking at this debate. But you cannot discuss this in isolation from legal factors and psychological and social factors. The law plays an intrinsic part of someone's right to work and participate in sport, and I'm not saying that should be prioritised in no way. I'm saying it should be dealt with equally, and if you're having a discussion around that table, should be a number of experts from a number of areas.
What we see obviously in the papers, on the news, on radio, is very much always talking about elite level sport. Is that really then having such an impact all the way down, do you think, into community level sport? I mean, you were saying obviously from a psychological point, Beth, that you are seeing the impact. Can you just explain a little bit further about that to us and sort of bring it to life for what it means to people you've worked with?
Yeah, we do see that these policies unfortunately have impact like at grassroots when people want to participate in sport at a recreational level, and I personally find that really problematic. And I think sometimes sporting organisations, sporting clubs will implement these policies because they think that that is the right thing to do, and they do it out of fear, but they don't look at whether that's going to be the right thing for people who might want to take part, and the messages that sends out. And, you know, referring back to that research, interview-based research that I did back in 2018, it was apparent that trans people were really worried about being part of a sports team and what that would mean for them. Not only, I suppose, because it might, you know, out them, they're going to have to out themselves as trans, which a lot of people, you know, understandably don't want to do, but then the implications that will have for them, you know, in terms of playing the sport. Will they receive discrimination from players, both within their team, outside? What is that going to be like? So, you know, it is really problematic, and I think in all of this as well, you know, gender diverse people get lost as well. So having this binary sport, especially at grassroots, at recreational levels, can be really problematic for people that perhaps don't have a gender identity that is male or female. So implementing them at that level is really problematic for people who have a gender identity outside the binary as well.
What are you hoping to achieve long term, and what do you think needs to go on in order to make sure that we keep sport fair and inclusive for everyone?
I think for me, it's really key to say that we are making progress by talking about it. You know, at the early stages of this research, again, it was very hypothetical. Not many people knew about it. If you asked somebody in the street what a trans person was, I don't think they would really know. So I think there is progress being made, and the fact that sports bodies are attempting to develop policy, to consult with people about policy, that is progress. But it's perhaps not going far enough in my opinion, in terms of pulling in key legal issues, psychological issues and social issues. I think it needs to go further by respecting the research in those fields rather than relying on a confined group of experts to determine eligibility.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And, you know, Seema, I think having more conversations about this is really important. And, you know, I get asked a lot about this within, you know, my professional life, but also my personal life. And by having a conversation with people, you know, you can't always change people's minds about this, and you want them to have their own opinions, but you do see a shift in their understanding by sharing kind of other perspectives on it. And I do think it's really important to have a variety of different experts involved in this, rather than just the emphasis on kind of this physiological, but I suppose it's even more than that. It's just this focus on testosterone, and the other aspects of this that should be brought to the table are completely neglected at current times.
And I think one role of research, one branch of research is obviously to educate. And so as researchers, our job is to educate people on these issues, and to ensure that truth drives the debate rather than the assumptions that are out there.
I mean, as researchers, both of you have obviously been researching this for a very long time, and yet I think for many of us, it's actually a very new topic. You know, can you just share from your perspective of being doing this for years and years, what is it that has changed? And perhaps what are the biggest challenges we face to get that sport for everyone, making it fair for everybody?
What's changed is the public opinion on this topic now, and how central it is. And again, it's a positive, but it's also a challenge when you are researching in the area, because you are up against, again, perhaps unfounded assumptions, opinions that perhaps have no logical basis. And that does become a challenge. But it's also, again, part of our role is to overcome those challenges, and hope that in time we can influence and change policy, and make sure that those truths are out there.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think in the time that I've been researching in this area, we have seen, I suppose, change in policy. We've seen improvements. And I think there is still a long way to go, but I agree that that's going to come from more conversations, more balanced conversations where a variety of different voices are heard. And I think it's also really important to hear from, transgender diverse people, ensure that they're heard in all of this, because, we can sit here and say, our piece on it all, but actually this affects trans and gender diverse people, and their voice really ultimately should be the most dominant in all of this, I feel.
And why at the moment isn't their voice out there, do you think?
Fear. Yes, I think so. And again, you touched on it. We've been researching for a long time, but it's funny how it is still in its infancy. And until more research is conducted, we're not going to have those voices heard.
And so ultimately, the research is going to create a safer space for those voices to come out?
Precisely.
Yeah, I think so. But unfortunately, I think we're still a long way off a robust evidence base. Definitely when it comes to like the role of testosterone, which at the minute is the focus, and waiting for that evidence base, I think is a long way off. So we need to look at the broader picture in the meantime.
That's what actually was going to be my last question, was what do you think needs to happen in the kind of immediacy to actually allow those voices to come forward? I mean, when you say a long time, Beth, how long are we talking, do you think?
I don't know if I'd want to put
sorry, put you on the spot
a precise kind of time frame on it, but I think we need to see the physiological evidence, but I'm not a biologist, I'm not a physiologist, so I don't know how long that's going to take, but I think we need to more broadly work towards making society more inclusive, and I think that will come a lot, like you said, Seema, through education. So educating people, compared to when I started working in this area, there is more knowledge and awareness of who trans people are, and we need to push that further. I think amongst very young populations, certainly students that I teach, there is very good awareness, and we need to continue with that to, I suppose, really get those voices heard, so trans people feel confident in coming forward. At the minute, society is not a welcoming place for a lot of trans and gender diverse people, so they're fearful about coming forward.
And just to expand on that, what's happening is in society, our gender identity is evolving, our understanding of gender identity is evolving, and as a result of that we're seeing legal gender status reforms taking place, where a gender identity is recognised legally in legislation and the human rights framework. And so that's taking place in society, and we have the conflict that's taking place in sport. And I've said it many times, but it will be eventually a question of to what extent sport is willing to accept the change in tide in society in terms of our gender identity. And I think for me, that it always comes back to that question.
So although obviously it's a very challenging space, as we've discussed already, is there also a sense that it's an exciting time that actually the conversation is being had?
Absolutely. I think it is an exciting time, and it's great to see research that you've been working on for so many years being spoken about so openly. One thing I'm working on, I'm looking at race discrimination as I kind of transition through my research, and I'm trying to better link ethnographic research with law and regulation. So I'm looking at lived experiences as myself as an athlete, or in terms of gender and race, and linking it to my research to see what the shortfalls are and what the gaps are, and how we can better improve research in the area in that way.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really interesting, and obviously it's a huge conversation, and it's been really nice to hear a different perspective, perhaps just from that biological side that we've heard so many times in the press recently. So if you'd like to find out more about Beth and Seema's work, you can find out more information in the episode description. Thank you. You've been listening to the Research Reimagined podcast by Nottingham Trent University. For all of the latest news from the research community at NTU, follow us on Twitter at NTU_research, or sign up to our research newsletter by visiting ntu.ac.uk/research. Thanks for listening.